Good morning and welcome to INSA's Coffee and Conversation with Julianne Gallina, Associate Deputy Director for the Directorate of Digital Innovation at CIA. Our program will begin shortly, but first, a message from our sponsor, EY. And now, please welcome INSA's President, Suzanne Wilson Heckenberg.
Thank you, and happy Tuesday, everyone. And thank you again for joining us for today's Coffee and Conversation. Before we begin today's program, though, I want to remind everyone of a few housekeeping notes. We welcome your questions once we get into the program. I would encourage you to identify yourself and your organization if you would like in the question box on the right side of the screen, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions. We're also pleased to welcome members of the press today to the program, and this is a reminder that the program is on the record and will be available for viewing later this week. And finally, it is now my pleasure to introduce Marissa Lightfoot, who is the Senior Director of Emerging Technologies for EY, who will introduce our guest speaker for today's Coffee and Conversation. Marissa, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marissa Lightfoot, and I'm the Emerging Technology Lead for the IC at EY. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, who's going to talk to us about her role accelerating development and integration of digital and cyber capabilities across all of CIA's mission areas. This is a subject in which we should all be deeply interested in because these capabilities will enhance our national security for generations to come. Our speaker has a unique combination of both insight and experience to make her the perfect executive to lead a discussion on this topic. Juliane Gallina has served her country in many ways. Her career in the national security field started at the U.S. Naval Academy, where she performed with honors and was the first woman to lead her brigade of midshipmen since the Academy's founding in 1846. Her impressive resume includes work in the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, the NRO, Executive Leadership and Industry, and is now back among the leadership team at CIA. She is one of the very few executives brought into the CIA at the SIS level, having been appointed CIO by Director Gina Haspel. And now Julianne serves as the Associate Deputy Director of CIA for Digital Innovation, working with Jennifer Eubank and Bill Spalding to ensure that CIA stays at the forefront of the digital landscape. Mrs. Gallina is consistently ranked as a top executive for multiple US IC-focused associations. Personally, I list her at the top of my most admired women in technology list. Please join me in welcoming Juliane Gallina.
Good morning, Marissa. Thank you so much for such a great introduction. You're so flattering. And good morning, Suzanne. It's wonderful to see you again.
It's great to have you. I was looking last night at the conversation that we had the last time that was very similar to this on June 23rd, 2020.
Oh my God.
COVID months and years, and here we are today in September of 22, and you're in a new role. And I think our listeners and viewers would love to hear about how some of your priorities have changed and your role has shifted since you were CIO there at CIA.
Well, I think being the CIO was one of my favorite jobs I've ever had. It's just amazing to be part of that team. And I was so grateful and indebted to the team of professionals I joined in the IT enterprise who were just completely transforming the foundational IT of our agency. One of the things I learned when I joined that really didn't resonate with me before, it's just very hard to know when you're on the outside, is that the structure of the agency was going to change the portfolio of what I considered a traditional CIO role. So the CIO at the agency has two peers the Chief Information Security Officer, and the Chief Data Officer. And at the time, the Information Security Officer, the CISO, was in a different directorate. So about the time that I became the Associate Deputy Director for Digital Innovation, Jennifer Eubank, our Directorate Chief, she asked me to plead up to be her deputy because at that time we were moving the CISO into our directorate, and it gave us for the first time an opportunity to create essentially a really holistic digital transformation strategy for the agency that combined the powers and the authorities of those three digital C-suites, the CIO, the CISO, and the Chief Data Officer. So we have combined those, and I've been working with those three executives to really create an interlocking set of strategies that will transform our foundational IT as well as our cyber defense. And really the breakthrough here is we realized that an IT strategy is necessary but insufficient without the focus on data. The data and IT together are necessary but insufficient without protections of a good cyber defense, and all of those strategies have to work together to really deliver for the whole of the agency. So I'm really excited that now in my remit that portfolio exists, and for the first time I'm having an opportunity to really work with our cyber operators, our open source professionals as well, because they exist in our directorate, as well as our digital futures organization, and a couple other small units.
So I think when we talked last week, you used the term arm in arm, and it really does sound like that is the way you're working with your partners there. So that's, I think, very encouraging for the community. We also talked a little bit about the importance of strengthening the relationship between the public and private sectors and that partnership. And you do have a plethora of experience with the military and in the private sector and also in government. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how industry kind of is incorporated into that fold these days, and particularly when it comes to technology and actually digital innovation.
Yeah, you point out my background, and it is unusual. It's really weird for someone to leave government and come back in, but I really think it speaks to a new era and an open-mindedness the agency has about partnering with industry and bringing talent into the agency as mid-career hires, or even like myself as executives, to help lead a digital transformation. Things have really changed even in the short time I've been back, but I'll take you back to 2015 when the agency embarked on a modernization initiative that ended up restructuring us. We established at the time mission centers for the first time, which are essentially like multidisciplinary problem-solving centers where we bring officers from all walks of the agency to focus on either a regional area or a functional topic like counterproliferation or counterterror, for example. And this multidisciplinary problem solving is really, really powerful. But if you think about it, that means that our directorates, the traditional directorates, become much like the military services in the Department of Defense. We have that role to supply, train, equip those mission centers with the people, the talent, the technology, the methodology or tradecraft that's necessary to really bring to bear on a mission challenge. All of this to say, ever since we reorganized in 2015, we've become really in the directorate very conscious of what we need to supply, train, and equip to those problem sets. And it's made us really conscious of the fact that our mission centers are largely asking for many of the same things in their digital transformation. And honestly, we know that just the numbers dictate alone, we're not going to do it by ourselves. This is a team sport. National security requires partnership with industry, and absolutely we're shifting toward much more openness with industry, trying not to be so opaque and closed about our acquisitions. And I think many of your listeners are probably observing that we've been much more forward-leaning in venues like this one. I mean, I really appreciate INSA amplifying our voice and getting our message out there because it makes us more open to industry. I guess the other thing I would point out that in all of this talk about the organization, most recently I want to flag a development for your listeners, all of our listeners here today. We've established in the past year and a half under the new leadership of Director Burns, since he was appointed, a new mission center that's focused on technology and transnational missions. And this is a signal to the rest of the world that the CIA has really made a very big shift in its understanding of where technology belongs in the whole ecosystem of national security. And let me explain. CIA has always been great at using technology to further its purposes in intelligence, to help human operations. We've been historically wonderful. We're really proud that we've just celebrated our 75th birthday, our anniversary. But what we haven't done in the past, if you think about it, where we've been great in focusing on technology is where either adversaries are using technology in a weapons system, where we can focus on it, we can reverse engineer it, we can understand it, we can keep track of it. Just think of the Cold War and how well the intelligence community did at really understanding where the Soviet Union was with its nuclear arms. But we haven't focused on technology as a subject of intelligence itself till recently. So creating this new mission center has helped us focus on emerging technologies as really because we understand adversaries are competing with us, trying to dominate these new emerging technology areas, things like AI and machine learning, microelectronics, 5G, 6G, and next generation communications, quantum computing. I could go on about biotechnologies, financial technologies. And we know that in order to compete, we need to really shift the foresight of our whole intelligence system to focus on technology as a subject area. We also need to be strategically competitive in using those emerging technologies, folding them into our own practices, our own use, and adopting the right technologies, focusing on tech transfer. And that's really in the directorates to do, and we continue to focus on that. So in my directorate, as well as in the Directorate of Science and Technology, we look to industry to help us source the right technologies and bring them in as fast as possible.
So I'm going to go back to a couple of things you mentioned earlier. One was being more opaque and engaging. And so again, thank you for being here today. We had Deputy Director Cohen last week at the AFCEA INSA Summit as part of the closing panel of IC agency directors and deputy directors, and so are very appreciative for that opportunity. But going back to, I'm going to sprinkle some of the questions in that are coming in as they relate to what we've talked about. But I have a student, Lucinda at Mercyhurst University. Lucinda, thanks for getting up and getting out of bed to ask this question. I assume you are anyway. She wants to know, you mentioned mission centers. She wanted to know how many are there and what are they?
Okay, so I'm not going to do the list because I think I would fail that quiz and forget someone, and you know, they'd be mad at me. But you can think about traditional areas that the intelligence community has been focused on that are functional areas. Counterproliferation and counterterror are two examples. But then we also have regional mission centers. So mission centers that essentially look at areas of responsibility so that we can focus on at either adversary activities or really where we need to partner with allies to understand what the threat is in a particular area. So the rest of the world is essentially divided into these areas of responsibility.
Great, that's super, super helpful. And you mentioned tech transfer. What are some of the key goals that you all have set forth to measure success related to tech transfer?
That's a great question. I love talking about measures, and for a very short time in my career, I was in a small company, only 35 people, it was a startup, and we were ultimately acquired by IBM. But during that time, I did a deep dive in quantitative analytics before people even had the phrase big data. So I love to nerd out about models and different measures, how you actually derive proxy measures for something that's very complex. And it's always a challenge, of course, because our agency has such a broad remit and our challenges are wide and varied, and we could start measuring a ton of things. And we have a lot of data. We have data that we use in the instrumentation of our agency. I'll say I could geek out about this topic for a long time. But at the end of the day, I could talk a lot about which specific measures and quantitative metrics. But I think it's really important that as technologists, we just pause and say the ultimate measure of success for us is whether or not our end users, the people who are in mission, are really able to do their job. And if they're satisfied and if their digital experience is superior to, I don't know, if it's excellent, then we're succeeding. So I think no matter what the quantitative metrics are, we have to validate whether or not our metrics are working by checking in with our end users in the beginning or the end of any kind of development cycle, and frequently throughout it, right? As we move toward agile methodology, we're always checking with our product owners or mission folks. Lately, I would tell you that in our directorate, we've been absolutely maniacal for this, like in a near-term sense. We know what our long-term strategy objectives are, but we also have been focused on having near-term objectives and scoring these objectives in a way that is very tangible with products and output that are material and meaningful to our end users. And so we've kind of broken up, figured out what our near-term next best steps are, made sure that they can result in something real, and have some score for it in a very close-in timeline. So we have some things that we're delivering just in December that are cross-cutting initiatives, and we'll keep scoring the performance of those initiatives throughout the following year. And we know that they align to our long-term strategy. So it gives us that constant validation that we're really making progress toward our long-term goals. Many of these near-term metrics are about movement of data, making sure that we're optimizing our back-end infrastructure, our compute infrastructure, hosting, how we work with our global infrastructure all over the place, all over the world, truly, to make sure that from the point of collection to readiness for exploitation, if you think about a traditional intelligence cycle, we've compressed that timeline and made it absolutely just like lightning fast.
Well, I think that's very encouraging to the folks that are tuning in today. You had talked a little bit earlier about your public-private background and relationships with external partners, but I wanted to hear a little bit about relationship with In-Q-Tel and Digital Futures, how you've advanced your ability to actually embark on maybe some new partnerships. And the second part of that question is how small business integrates into that as well.
Okay, if I forget to get to the last question, you just have to remind me, Suzanne, but let me start with In-Q-Tel. And let me get back to that new mission center that I mentioned, Technology and Transnational Mission Center, T2MC. This new mission center has folded In-Q-Tel into its mission, as well as what was formerly the DS&T's CIA labs. The Directorate of Digital Innovation, my directorate, continues to help with Digital Futures, our team, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But all to say that there's this technology ecosystem at the agency where we're trying lots of different things. In-Q-Tel is decades old, and that's a good thing because we know that there's a proven model there for tech transfer, and we can point to some really tremendous innovations and places where we've successfully transitioned technology that has been essentially seed funded by In-Q-Tel, a venture capital model that has backing from the US government, from our agency. We've been able to transition some of that technology into our agency. Some of that technology is well, I think the key difference with In-Q-Tel is that it's dual purpose. So some of those companies may start with us, but then they may pivot more toward a commercial model. And that's good too, because we know that there's a virtuous cycle there when the government is sparking innovation and helping with this whole, this bubbling of innovation, especially among small companies. So In-Q-Tel continues to serve that purpose. Under the leadership of the new Associate Director for T2MC, I know that there's been a resurgence of interest in the In-Q-Tel model and how to take as much learning as we can. As we open our doors to industry, and as government professionals, we want to have more of an open door. We're really looking to In-Q-Tel to help us navigate these new markets and new technologies. So that's an exciting area too, where it's not so much like, hey, am I going to buy this widget and ultimately plunk it into my IT architecture, but what can I learn about these disruptive technologies and how do I position us? And it's kind of a longer term, more strategic play, but I think it's very fruitful. So that's In-Q-Tel. You asked me about Digital Futures, and I'm telling you, Randy Nixon is our chief for Digital Futures, He and his team are just tearing it up. I'd love to get feedback from your listeners, but when I check in with industry, I get such positive feedback because Digital Futures has made a pivot, and they've released something called Digital Hammer Broad Area Announcement this past summer. Since they've released the BAA, they have received hundreds of new inquiries from industry. These hundreds of small companies that didn't have a relationship with us before, who are now bidding on real work in our agency. And Randy has made it, I was just talking to him yesterday, I was just so struck by this. He said, because I know I get a lot of LinkedIn activity, but I'm gonna skip all day. I can't be on my mobile phone. It's hard to respond to everything in a timely fashion, although I aspire to. Randy said, I get back to everyone. Everyone. That is really, really hard to do. And I just think he and his team are modeling such exemplary behavior of what we're hoping to show to industry in this partnership, like the openness and listening and trying to help you and industry navigate our very closed off agency so we can make the right connections. So this BAA has just unleashed tremendous innovation, and Randy and his leadership and his team have been tremendous.
Great. Well, I wanted to reiterate, you asked for feedback on Digital Futures. And so if anybody has any feedback and they want to share it in the Q&A, I will have someone gather that information, and we'll give it back to Julianne after the webinar. But I think it'll all be quite positive. So we're happy to be the gatherer of that information. So I'd ask a little bit about small business, and it's great to hear about the ways that you all are proactively engaging. I actually have a question from someone at a small business. Pete Camp with Enabled Intelligence says, so great to get your perspective, Julianne. The agency has large troves of intelligence data. How is the agency using new approaches to data labeling and tagging to make that data available to emerging AI tools to help CIA analysts leverage that data faster?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. And I will tell you, I wish I had a whiteboard, because there's this like magic square 2x2 that one of our tech directors showed me, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's perfect. And I guess I would start with to explain, if you can, in your mind's eye, imagine like a 2x2 matrix, and on one axis this is all regarding AI and machine learning. On one axis, think data, and on the other axis, think models. So if you know, for those of you who are students of AI and machine learning, look, I don't have a PhD in it, but I've been around it now for a long time, since my days in IBM working on the Watson technologies. You need a lot of data to train models for machine learning, to improve your accuracy, precision, recall for results. And consequently, it's hard when you're in the intelligence community. It's true, we have tons of data, classified data that's been resourced, but the truth is it's eclipsed by commercial data. And if you want to have, like, let's just say object detection that can recognize red cars, I'm just making this up off the top of my head, red cars are not classified, and a machine learning model will be trained more effectively on the low side with commercial data than with whatever imagery data or GeoInt data we can get that has red cars in it. So we're better off really training models on the low side and bringing models up. So back to that 2x2, if you think about this idea of models on one axis and data on the other, right? I'm like really getting rudimentary here. If you think about it down close to the bottom of the axis, you think about our models and our data. And on the far ends of these axes would be their models and their data. So what do I mean by that? I mean, the times when the CIA will use our own machine learning models and our own data should be very few and precious, and it should be reserved for things that are really exquisitely only found in classified content. The rest of it should be on the far end, like on the other end. We should be working with AI and machine learning using commercial models and commercial data. Now, your question, the person who asked the question, was asking about some other things too, like what are we doing with data labeling and tagging? And I will tell you, it's still early days. We don't have one solution. I think that's a good thing. And there's many ways to do this. I think what becomes really interesting, if you go back to this idea of, ideally we're doing the majority of our AI and machine learning training out with commercial data in the commercial world, there comes some interesting challenges. Like, can we take commercially trained models, bring them into our skipped environment, and then actually run them on our data and then train again on our data to really fit it for our particular mission? That's a great way to do a kickstart. And this notion of transfer learning is something that I don't think anyone's really great at yet. So we're really open to ideas there. Conversely, the idea of training something with our data, but their models, or vice versa, their models, our data, and this is getting confusing. I think this is an area where we really have to focus.
Well, I did take away transfer learning. So if we have any viewers who have any subject matter expertise there, we see that there is a need. I'm glad you mentioned earlier the low side and unclassified work. I have a question here pertaining to unclassified work. What has been done or is continuing to be done to allow industry partners to operate in an unclassified domain? Particularly as many still operate in a hybrid environment. I know we've seen this evolve and ebb and flow over the past couple of years, but we'd love to get your feedback on the unclassified domain.
I think the pandemic in some respects was helpful to catalyze innovation in this area. And I'm not sure if I shared this with you in 2020, but when about that time, because we spoke in June of 2020, so it was 3 months after we had sent a lot of people home. Not everyone, of course, we had to keep our lights on, and we were still operating as an agency, but it was really difficult because many of our industry partners had to either work from their buildings or they could not come into our skipped environments because we need to preserve social distancing. And yet we needed to get the mission done, and people were so creative. We moved so fast. For the IT enterprise alone, hundreds of task orders were modified in just a few weeks to move thousands of contractors into either unclassified environments or secret environments, so not quite TSSCI, or into other SCIFs and other areas so they could do work off-site. And the speed with which that was done was pretty breathtaking. It was really nice to see everyone unite to get that done, to keep everyone safe. But it showed us that we can do things that were previously unimaginable. Another aspect to that is we had to think differently about how we were partnering with industry, where in the past we might have said, well, we're going to put everything on a labor contract and we're going to integrate the work and direct the work within our own SCIF environment. The pandemic allowed us to really prompt some different thinking about putting things on task orders that allowed us to do work in a completion type basis, meaning we were asking our industry partners to deliver something that was functional at a particular point of maturity, and that would be the completion milestone. And by doing that, we were able to keep the work going, but allow vendors to really have a lot of creativity to do the work that they needed to do in a separate building, in a separate place. I think this is unlocking new pathways to be able to increase, if not totally unclassified work, a lot of secret level work, which would give us access to a lot more talent all over the country, a lot more connectivity to industry partner spaces, and I think it's a really burgeoning area.
So it's a common theme, across the community. I've heard this a lot, and we don't want to go back to the way things were. I mean, there are any silver linings, which I said I would never say again in regard to the past couple of years, but how do we get traction there and not go backwards?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's on the leadership to really keep the focus. And we have really a great partnership with the Office of Procurement Executive. Margaret Augustine is our Chief Executive for Acquisition at the agency. She's been very supportive of this, she and her team. They've been wonderful. We have recurring conversations. Every time we review a major acquisition, Suzanne, in our directorate, and we do multiple checks, Bill Spalding and I sit on every single review before any acquisition goes forward to become an RFI. We just think it's really important that we understand the structures of the contracts. And one of our objectives, not the only objective, but one is to really check for how innovative and forward-leaning are we being with models that move the work off-site, do the work at a classification level. And some of that we can put into boilerplate contract language, but it really does require senior kind of attention and focus, because it's very easy for people to know, well, you know, this one's going to go in a skiff and we'll do it the way we've always done it. So we're constantly checking.
Great. Well, I think it's on folks like us to keep that drumbeat moving along, so we don't go backwards. I have a question.
No, you're right, Suzanne, because industry partners who come into the building and spend time with me, they're constantly reminding me that they want to do the work at a lower classification level, so they can deliver better quality, move faster. I hear you, right? We are moving toward that, but not everything can be done at a low level.
And it also feeds in, I think, to the well-being of our workforce. INSA hosted an event back in July, and we had a panel, and it was get a life, work-life blend. And I am having T-shirts made up with that slogan on it. And I will be wearing them to a webinar quite soon. I just need to get one of my kids to design it. So anyway, we've got a question here from Ellen Nakashima. She wants to know, as data becomes more and more central to everything the CIA does, how is DDI's view on data security and data access evolving?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Ellen. That is a hot topic. I mentioned earlier that we're really maniacal about our data strategy. Hurley Blankenship is our Chief Data Officer. Lakshmi Raman is our Director for AI and Machine Learning. We have a new CIO, Linnea Jones, who has been at NSA and the IC, and she's wonderful, and we're so excited that she's joined us. And Rich Bache is our new CISO, who's come from industry. And I think these four executives are really important because as Hurley delivers and implements on the data strategy, this is getting back to what I was talking about earlier. All of these C-suite executives, they have to work together. We know that there are two qualities of systems and solutions or technology that are absolutely necessary for our end users to adopt them. Number one, they want us to deliver things fast. That's great, right? I know speed's important. We have to deliver in a timely way. And things obviously have to be performant. It's almost like shouldn't require saying if you're not going to do it right, don't deliver it. But performant and fast. But in our agency, if our mission and users can't trust our systems, if they don't think their data that's important for their mission, if they don't trust those systems, they're not going to use them. They will go build their own. We're a pretty well-resourced agency, and the beauty of our agency is we move fast and we give people a lot of authority to do things out in the mission. And in fact, I would say if mission folks can't trust our systems, they shouldn't use them. So we've gotten extremely, extremely focused on having this data strategy backed with zero trust architecture principles. Now I know that's a buzzy word. Everyone's like, oh, don't say ZTA, because we're sick of hearing it. But what I really mean by this is shifting to the continuous monitoring and interrogation, which requires universal ICAM or identity, credential, and access management that helps us ensure that end users are really accessing the correct information with the proper authorities. And it requires our data to be appropriately stored, archived in the repositories that have put the correct tags on this data. This is all interlocking, so you see we can't have the data strategy without the proper zero trust architecture principles in our built throughout. So we're really focused. And I think Ellen's question is really getting at something else. I mean, she's pointing out artfully that there's a tension, right? Like how do it's counter to our culture to aggregate all of our data. You think about it, for all these missions, you don't just dump it in one repository and say, okay, our job here is done, everybody can get to it. Because we still have the need to know principle, we still have to protect it. And that requires us to be really focused on our security controls, our cybersecurity controls. We also have to be very thoughtful about how we protect our tradecraft and identities properly, because we are the agency and those things don't go away. We are special in that respect. And so our technology professionals need to know quite a bit about mission, or at least have that tight partnership with mission and users, so we can understand how do we protect their tradecraft and protect them as they're using the data.
Well, and I'm glad you referenced zero trust. It was part of the theme of our summit last week. Okay to use those words. They're crucial.
I feel like I get beat up when I use it. Everyone's like, oh, Julie had to use that word.
So Sue Gordon at Gordon Ventures says, both the CIA and the NSA collect and analyze digital information. How does what you do differ in mission, scale, or target set? So mission, scale, and target set.
Oh, that's great. Well, you know, okay, the elementary school level is NSA is the SIGINT agency, and we are the HUMINT agency. But I also like to point out the CIA is called Central for a reason, right? People forget CIA has become like a word of its own because it's such an oft-used acronym. But it was intended to be the place to fuse all source. So we do use SIGINT, we do enable SIGINT, we help HUMINT with SIGINT. So there's a partnership there, but I mean, to first order, you can think of NSA being really, really the pros at signals intelligence. One of the things that's somewhat different, of course, with NSA is that it's a combat support agency. And so it has authorities derived from the Department of Defense, and their executives do have those authorities. And that means that they're going to have kind of a different set of end users and requirements. Some of the requirements for a large-scale SIGINT really drive them toward intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR systems that are massive in scale and contribute to a situational awareness mission, right? It's not the end users for situational awareness might be people who are trying to keep track of where things are in time and place. So using SIGINT to create that operational picture. Whereas for us, our primary end users are going to be policymakers or the HUMINTers, the people who are doing HUMINT operations who require technology. So I think those are important big concepts to keep in mind. So in terms of mission, our agency, as I was mentioning before, our mission centers divide up the entire world so that we're trying to keep track so we can advise policymakers on intelligence and threats emerging from any place in the world. Of course, not CONUS, not the United States of America, that's not our jurisdiction, but we're looking all over the world, and NSA does too. So the physical location on the planet is not a difference. It's really our end user customer set that can differ.
Great, that's helpful. So I have several questions related to recruitment, retention, clearance process. I'm going to try to wrap them all up into one, but I've got Matt Scott with Advantis. I've got a student, Elise Greger at Georgetown University, and Joseph Zamoita. And one of the questions is, what is government doing to attract and retain the best talent to support CIA? And I'm going to interject, what are you all doing to get the clearance process moving along in perhaps a more timely fashion? And I use my own words there. So
I think people in the industry might have either heard about or they're beginning to hear about our director's emphasis on hiring and recruiting. And it's kind of like, for me with technology, what I owe our end users is that they have to trust the process, they have to trust our technology, and I have to deliver it fast. I think the director is giving the same challenge and imperative to our talent organization, saying, okay, this is a whole team effort, all hands on deck, everyone in the agency needs to help the talent center. We are going to figure out how to get people in as fully employed in a much, much shorter time frame. I don't know if the time is actually sensitive, so I will hesitate from saying the actual timeline, but it's pretty, we're talking orders of magnitude, shorter periods of time, but we have to trust that the security process and background checks are also completed adequately, that we haven't taken shortcuts, because we really do ask our employees to have tremendous responsibilities to care for very sensitive data and missions and to care for each other. And it's important to hire the right people. So we're not taking shortcuts in the process, but I think that there's a lot of focus on not just leaning out the hiring process, but also understanding, helping to encourage the right people to apply, having different channels for application that didn't exist before, different ways of actually going out and proactively look for the right candidates and encourage people to apply, creating relationships with academic institutions. Some have been long-standing partnerships, but of course we're really keen to have our agency reflect the full diversity, not just of the United States, but the whole world. We want our whole workforce to bring up all the full skills and talents that come with rich, diverse, and inclusive environment. So we're really focused on this, and I'm already seeing that. I mentioned before, we're really focused on delivering things. By December, the director has given us an imperative to help the Talent Center meet their goals, and I think the median hiring time will have dropped by orders of magnitude by this December.
Orders of magnitude. I really like that.
Yeah,
So,
it's pretty phenomenal.
So I'm going to get a virtual eye roll from some folks I know, but I also have to put in a plug in. INSA has 6 graduate school interns, all who want to work in the intelligence community and would love to start their clearance process when they start graduate school. So if anybody has any ideas out there or wants to help sponsor them for a clearance, please reach out to me. Email is on our website. So I've got time for one more question. Charlie Sowell says, hello, shipmate. Could you tell us how your experience as an industry executive has helped you focus on the agency's emerging technologies and challenges now that you're back in government? And Charlie, I'm glad you asked this question because we do talk about the value of going back and forth between the public and private sector and the different perspectives that brings to the mission and individual roles. So I'd love to hear what you have to share about that, Julianne.
Yeah, I have to say, Charlene and I were classmates at the Naval Academy, and thanks for your question, Charlene. It's great to hear you're out there. Go Navy. So I also appreciate the question because it does kind of point out something that's a little bit odd, but I think a strength in my background, having spent a decade in industry. Culturally, this makes me different because I think I'm quite sympathetic, because I've walked in the shoes of people in industry who've tried to help government understand how industry can solve a problem. And I really think it's changed the way I think about leading and growing talent at the agency. And this is kind of a long-term play. I can't flip a switch and change the culture overnight, but really trying to help people understand that the open door and the conversation with industry is crucial to our collective success. US industry and US national security, we need to band together because our adversaries are competing with all of us. Whereas in the past, you might think an adversary was competing with the US national security industry. Today, adversaries are competing in big tech areas. We need US industry to be strong. This has got to be a partnership. And helping even very junior employees understand that we shouldn't be they need to be fair in ensuring that conversations with all of our vendor community are equal and fair, but we can be equally open and equally transparent to all in order to help address the requirements that the government has. And helping even relatively junior employees understand that, okay, we can keep the federal acquisition regulations in mind, right, but we shouldn't be so hidebound and fearful that we're going to break a rule that it inhibits conversation. So to first order, it's just like having the conversation and being open to it. But then I also think for me, my perspective on having learned a lot about the technologies that were emerging, things like IoT, artificial intelligence, and emphasis on machine learning, especially around human language technologies, natural language processing, text analytics, some other kind of imaging analytics as well, object detection and things like that. That's really infused my point of view about how we have to clean up the whole back end of the architecture, because you can't get to AI and learning maturity until you're really able to manipulate the data, move the data from collection to the point of exploitation. We have to be able to do all of that blocking and tackling with data first. Otherwise, we're just kind of pouring money into this top of the pyramid with AI and machine learning, and we'll never get there because our analysts have to be able to apply those microservices to the vast amounts of data that we have. And again, we talked about this earlier in the conversation. Some of this will happen out in industry. Preferably more of it will happen in industry and the commercial world, and we'll be able to manipulate the data there and bring in only what we need.
Well, I think that's a good tone to end on as far as collaboration goes between the public and private sector. 45 minutes flies by. Let's make sure we don't let this much time pass between now and it did back in June of 20 before we have an opportunity to chat again. But really just wanted to thank you for being so candid with us today. I think it means a lot to our public and private sector viewers, as well as some of the students who are up and learning virtually today. And I also just wanted to thank EY, our sponsor for today's program, for making it possible to bring you here virtually, and remind folks that when this webinar ends, there'll be a quick short survey. Please fill it out. We want to hear from you. We need your feedback. And then remind our viewers that we are going out to Colorado, and so we'll be headed out there on Tuesday, September 27th for Unclassified Reception and Keynote from Sandra Octor, who is the director of NGA Denver. And then we'll be hosting a classified discussion the next morning on cybersecurity of space systems. And please check out on our website the opportunity to nominate one of your colleagues or your partners for a 2023 Achievement Award. And finally, for our government colleagues, we are happy to announce that the INSA Foundation is now approved for the Combined Federal Campaign Charity if you want to select us on your CFC selections. Really appreciate everybody tuning in this morning. It's a fast conversation, a quick goodbye, but I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thanks again, Julianne.